Have you ever wondered how many stories begin with the children of Zeus, and how many of Greece's most enduring myths quietly grow from that one vast divine family? Good evening and welcome. Tonight, we'll move slowly through the many sons and daughters said to be born to Zeus, or claimed by later storytellers as part of his immense and complicated household. Some were gods, some were heroes, some were protectors of cities, some were feared, and some lived in the space between worship and legend. Their stories were told in temples, on painted pottery, in epic poems, in local cults, and in the long memory of the ancient world. If you enjoy these quiet journeys, you're welcome to like, subscribe, or leave a gentle comment, perhaps with where you're listening from tonight, or what calm topic you'd like to visit next. Settle in now and let the room grow a little softer around you. Let the bright edges of the day fade away. There is no hurry here, only a slow walk through myth, family, and the old human habit of imagining the divine in familiar shapes. And so, with the night around us, we can begin with the first of these careful facts. The children of Zeus form one of the broadest and most layered families in Greek mythology, and that breadth is part of what made Zeus such a central figure in ancient storytelling. He was imagined not only as a ruler, but as a father whose lineage touched almost every region of the Greek mythic world. Some of his children were born from other gods, some from mortal women, and some from local traditions that later became tied to his name. That wide range meant the family was never simple. It was a living web of divine authority, heroic memory, and local identity, stretching across mountains, temples, coastlines, and the quiet corners of old oral tradition. In the ancient world, genealogy was never just a list of names. It was a way of making sense of how things belonged together. When people told stories about Zeus's children, they were often connecting a person or a city to a larger order of meaning. A god could explain a craft, a virtue, a festival, or even a pattern of weather. A hero could explain why a family claimed special standing. A goddess could stand for the memory of a city's hopes and anxieties. In that way, the children of Zeus were not only characters in stories, they were also parts of a larger cultural vocabulary used to speak about power, inheritance, and the shape of the world. When ancient listeners heard a tale involving one of Zeus's children, they were often hearing more than a single story. They were hearing a claim about power, ancestry, and place. A city might honor one child of Zeus as its protector. A royal house might trace its prestige to another. A poet might use a son or daughter of Zeus to explain why a hero seemed larger than ordinary life. In this way, the family itself became a mythic map, with each child marking out a different kind of authority, a different kind of blessing, and sometimes a different kind of trouble. One gentle example is Athene, who is often counted among Zeus's most important children. Her birth, wisdom, and military intelligence gave her a special place in Athens and beyond. She was not merely a daughter in a family list. She was a symbol of order, strategy, craft, and civic pride. In some traditions, she emerged fully armed from Zeus's head, a striking image that ancient audiences clearly found memorable. The picture is strange, but it is also carefully symbolic. It suggests thought becoming action, intelligence becoming protection, and power becoming something disciplined rather than wild. Ancient people did not treat these divine relatives as decorative names. They treated them as forces shaping the world they believed they lived in. Athene's connection to weaving, handicraft, planning, and practical intelligence made her especially beloved in city life. Her presence could be felt in public buildings, household rituals, and stories about wise counsel. She was also a goddess who could be stern, and that sternness mattered. Wisdom in Greek myth was rarely soft in a simple sense. It could be precise, demanding, and watchful. Athene represented a kind of strength that did not need to shout. For that reason, she became one of the clearest examples of how a child of Zeus could embody not just raw divine power, but an ordered and recognizable form of it. Another famous child is Apollo, though his parentage was sometimes told with different emphases in different traditions. He became linked to music, prophecy, healing, and the measured beauty of form. In sanctuaries and poems alike, Apollo often appears as a god of clarity. He is associated with the lyre, with oracles, with radiant presence, and with a kind of disciplined grace. Even where myths varied, the idea remained clear. Zeus's offspring were not all the same type of power. Together, they represented the many faces of divine influence: wisdom, war, beauty, law, fertility, and judgment. Apollo's presence in myth often feels like a long, bright line cutting through uncertainty, though never removing uncertainty entirely. There is also something quietly important about the way Apollo's stories connect sound and meaning. His music can charm, but it can also reveal. His prophecy can guide, but it can also unsettle. In some tales, the gift of knowing comes with distance, and the divine voice speaks in ways that mortals must interpret carefully. This makes Apollo a fitting child of Zeus because his power is both elevated and ambiguous. He is not simply gentle and not simply severe. He belongs to the family of a god whose children often reveal how mixed and difficult divine gifts can be. A similar pattern appears with Artemis, the calm and untamed goddess of the hunt. She was often paired with Apollo, and together the twins created a sense of balance between brightness and shadow, precision and wildness. Artemis moved through forests, high hills, and the edges of civilization, places where the human world thins and the natural world feels more immediate. She could be protectress, punisher, and companion of animals, and her myths often keep that layered character intact. Her closeness to the wilderness made her feel both distant and intimate, as though she stood just beyond the lamplit edge of the settlement. The twin relationship between Artemis and Apollo mattered to ancient imagination because it suggested harmony in difference. One child of Zeus could govern the shining discipline of music, prophecy, and measured form, while another could rule over the cool spaces of the hunt and the ungoverned movement of wild things. Their stories remind us that Greek mythology rarely isolates a figure completely. The children of Zeus are often heard in relation to one another, as if each one reveals a different possible direction for divine life. Even their contrasts feel part of a larger pattern, one that gives the ancient gods their memorable depth. The family also stretches into the realm of heroes. Heracles, perhaps the most famous heroic son of Zeus, stands at the border between mortal struggle and divine favor. His labors are remembered not only as feats of strength, but as a long and painful path through suffering, endurance, and eventual reward. In him, Zeus's lineage becomes something heavy and difficult, not simply glorious. The child of a god can still be burdened by grief, anger, and impossible tasks. Heracles is powerful, but he is not serene. His myths are full of endurance, violence, service, and hardship, and they often show that greatness in Greek tradition can be inseparable from suffering. Heracles also mattered because he was both extraordinary and strangely human in the texture of his story. He could perform deeds that ordinary people would never imagine, yet his life remained troubled by conflict, punishment, and uncertainty. That combination gave his myths lasting force. Ancient audiences could admire his strength while also recognizing the loneliness and cost of being set apart. As a son of Zeus, he became a figure through whom the Greeks could think about the burden of being chosen, the strain of fame, and the uneasy link between divine blood and mortal pain. That is one reason the family stays interesting. The children of Zeus are not just powerful, they are varied. They include protectors, challengers, helpers, wanderers, and figures who disturb the peace. Some bring civilization, some test it, some are celebrated, some are feared. In the ancient imagination, that variety reflected the world itself, which was never neat, never fully safe, and never easy to explain. A divine family that broad could contain both order and disruption, and that made it useful for storytellers who needed to explain almost anything. Because of that, the stories attached to Zeus's children often became a way for ancient Greeks to think about inheritance, character, and fate. Why does one person excel in battle while another excels in speech? Why does one city feel watched over by a bright goddess while another tells stories of a wandering hero? Myth answered these questions not with science, but with family. The gods were related, and the world was therefore related too. A gift in one generation could reappear in another. A divine trait could become a human talent. A local cult could preserve a memory that seemed older than the village itself. This is part of why Zeus's children appear so often in regional traditions. Different places like to tell their own versions. One community might emphasize a god's local birth. Another might focus on a hero's journey. Another might preserve a festival, a shrine, or a ritual that helped anchor the story in daily life. In this sense, myth was not a single book, but a network of remembered voices. The children of Zeus were carried through those voices, sometimes changing shape slightly as they moved from one setting to another, yet remaining recognizable enough to hold their place in the wider Greek world. That sense of relation is one of the quiet foundations of the whole subject. To speak of Zeus's children is to step into a family drama that stretches across gods, mortals, and landscapes. It is also to step into a mythology that was never fixed in one version, but kept changing as local traditions, poets, and worshippers added their own careful details. The result is a family tree that is less like a neat diagram and more like an ancient grove, with branches crossing, roots hidden, and many paths leading back toward the same towering trunk. Some children of Zeus were also tied to major civic ideals, which is part of what made them so enduring. A god or goddess could embody the kind of excellence a city wished to see in itself. Wisdom, moderation, courage, skill, eloquence, and justice all found a place somewhere in the family. At the same time, the family also contained more unsettling powers, reminding listeners that divine favor could not be separated from danger, jealousy, pain, or transformation. The children of Zeus were never only there to comfort. They also explained why life could be so difficult, even when the gods were near. In art and poetry, these figures often appear with a kind of calm clarity that makes them feel timeless. A spear, a bow, a lyre, a shield, a cloak, a laurel branch. These objects are simple, but they carry a great deal of meaning. They help the listener or viewer recognize the child of Zeus and understand the kind of presence being invoked. Over time, such symbols became deeply familiar, almost ceremonial in their quiet repetition. They helped the myths settle into memory, the way a familiar melody can settle softly into the mind. And so, as we continue, it helps to remember that each child of Zeus carries not only a story, but a small piece of the ancient Greek imagination itself. Some are bright and steady, some are fierce, some are hard to place in a single category. Together they show how the Greeks thought about divine power not as a single voice, but as a family of forces, each with its own temperament, its own sphere, and its own lasting echo. When people first look at the name Children of Zeus, it can feel almost mythological, but the Zeus sound is grounded in something much more human and immediate. Part of their appeal comes from how naturally their music carries the weight of everyday life without ever sounding heavy-handed. Their songs often move with the unhurried confidence of two artists who understand that small details can hold a great deal of meaning. A passing reflection, a domestic scene, a quiet memory from a train ride or a late-night street, these simple things become the material of something larger. In that sense, the group fits into a long tradition of soul music that finds dignity in ordinary experience, and a listener can feel that lineage even when the exact reference points are not obvious. There is a softness in the way their ideas arrive, but also a careful structure underneath, as if each line has been placed where it is for both emotional and musical balance. That sense of balance becomes especially clear when you listen closely to the textures around their vocals. Children of Zeus often work with production that feels warm rather than polished in a glossy way, and that warmth is part of the atmosphere their recordings create. The drums usually sit back just enough to let the rhythm breathe, while the melodic layers seem to hover with a kind of dusk-like calm. A sample might flicker in and out like a remembered detail, never demanding too much attention, yet always contributing to the overall mood. In many modern productions, the arrangement is built to impress quickly, but here there is more patience. The songs allow themselves to unfold slowly, and that slowness can feel almost restorative. It suggests a production philosophy that values space, feeling, and texture over display, which is one reason their records can be replayed many times without losing their gentle pull. Their writing also carries a distinctive relationship to place, especially to Manchester and the broader Northern English setting that shaped them. Even when a song does not mention a specific street or district, there is often a sense of urban weather in the background, of brick, rain, distance, and late-night movement through familiar roads. Yet the music is not locked into local realism alone. Instead, the setting becomes a kind of emotional geography, a map of feeling that can be recognized far beyond one city. This is part of why their work has traveled well. Listeners do not need to know the exact corners of Manchester life to understand the mood. They only need to recognize the mixture of resilience and tenderness, the way an individual can hold hope, fatigue, humor, and longing all at once. That quiet complexity gives the songs a lived-in quality that feels both specific and universal. It is also worth noticing how often their songs seem to value conversation as much as confession. Rather than presenting emotion as a dramatic solo statement, Children of Zeus frequently build tracks that feel like exchanges, even when one voice dominates the center. There is a sense that meaning is being shaped in relation to another person, whether that is a partner, a friend, a city, or even an older version of the self. This call and response spirit has deep roots in soul, gospel, and hip-hop, but in their hands it becomes especially intimate. The effect is less like watching a performance from a distance and more like sitting in a softly lit room while someone speaks thoughtfully, pauses, and then returns to the thought with a little more detail. That conversational quality can make the listening experience feel comforting, almost companionable, as though the songs are willing to keep you company rather than command your attention. Their imagery often works in the same understated way. Instead of filling every line with dense symbolism, they tend to let one or two carefully chosen images do the emotional lifting. A room, a sky, a road, a memory of movement, a familiar face, these things can recur with slight variation, creating the feeling of a life being observed from different angles. In more academic terms, one might say their writing favors accumulation over explosion. They are not always trying to astonish in a single line. Instead, they build a calm pressure through repetition and nuance. That approach can be especially effective in music meant for late hours, because the mind does not have to work hard to follow the thread. It can simply drift along with the images, sensing the emotional shape without needing every detail pinned down. There is comfort in that openness, in the fact that the songs leave room for the listener's own memories to settle inside them. Another striking feature of the duo's work is the way they balance masculinity with vulnerability. In some musical contexts, confidence is performed through hardness, volume, or emotional restraint, but Children of Zeus often suggest another model. Their presence can be assured without being armored. Their lyrics may acknowledge pride, responsibility, desire, disappointment, and weariness, yet the overall effect is not defensive. It feels mature in the old sense of the word, as though strength includes the ability to admit uncertainty. This can be especially moving in songs about relationships, where tenderness is not framed as weakness, but as part of a full emotional life. The voices carry a kind of weathered calm, suggesting people who have lived enough to know that clarity is rare, and that care is often expressed in ordinary gestures rather than grand declarations. For a sleep-listening atmosphere, that emotional register is especially gentle, because it offers reassurance without becoming sentimental. Their connection to hip-hop culture remains important too, even when their music leans strongly into soul and R&B. The duo's phrasing, timing, and sense of rhythm often reflect a rapper's instinct for cadence, emphasis, and internal flow. Even their sung passages can feel shaped by the pulse of spoken word, with lines placed in ways that respect the beat and leave room around each phrase. This blending of traditions helps explain why their work can feel both classic and contemporary. It draws from older soul structures, but the delivery and attitude are informed by modern British urban music, where genres have long mixed and evolved together. That hybrid identity gives the music its subtle momentum. It does not rush, but it keeps moving. And because the rhythmic intelligence is so carefully controlled, the songs remain engaging even in a quiet listening environment where the volume is low and the room itself is almost still. There is also a notable emotional intelligence in the way they handle nostalgia. Some artists treat the past as a place to escape to, but children of Zeus usually seem more interested in memory as something that informs the present. Their songs may look backward, yet they rarely become trapped there. Instead, the past appears as texture, as background light, as a set of lessons carried forward. That can make the music feel wiser than simply sentimental. It understands that memory is selective and often imperfect, that what we remember is shaped by feeling as much as fact. In that sense, the duo's approach has something quietly scholarly about it, even if it never sounds academic. They seem aware that identity is constructed over time, through revisiting, revising, and reinterpreting what has already happened. This is one reason their songs can feel so emotionally settled. They are not searching frantically for meaning, but gently arranging the pieces into a form that can be lived with. Their collaborations and musical relationships also help reveal how open their project has been. Rather than presenting themselves as a sealed-off unit, they often move within a wider community of producers, vocalists, and artists who share similar values of soulfulness, craft, and honesty. That networked quality matters because it keeps the music from feeling isolated. It belongs to a larger conversation about modern Black British music, about the afterlife of soul, and about how local scenes sustain themselves through mutual support. In scenes like this, influence rarely travels in a straight line. It moves through guest spots, informal exchanges, live shows, shared studios, and the simple act of listening to each other's work. Children of Zeus feel very much part of that living current. Their sound may be distinctive, but it is not solitary. It carries traces of a wider musical ecology, one that values tone, trust, and the patience needed for songs to mature over time. The duo's pacing in general is part of what makes them so suitable for a calmer listening experience. They rarely seem in a hurry to resolve an idea. Even when a track has clear structure, it often invites the listener to dwell in the middle rather than race toward the end. This can create an almost meditative quality, though not in a rigid or solemn sense. The calm comes from ease, from trust in the material. The arrangement allows the groove to breathe, the voice to settle, and the atmosphere to deepen without interruption. For listeners at the edge of sleep, that kind of pacing can be especially effective because it mirrors the gradual slowing of thought itself. The music does not yank attention upward, it lowers the temperature gently. It is the sort of sound that can make a room feel dimmer, softer, and slightly more suspended in time, as though evening has stretched out a little further than expected. And beneath all of this lies a strong sense of craftsmanship. Children of Zeus are not simply creating mood by instinct, they are shaping it with precision. The interplay between vocal melody, lyrical detail, instrumental restraint, and rhythmic placement suggests a deep understanding of how songs hold together. Yet the craftsmanship never draws attention to itself in a mechanical way. The best kind of musical skill often disappears into feeling, and that is very much the case here. The listener may not consciously notice how carefully a phrase lands or how a harmony opens a moment of emotional space, but the body notices. The shoulders ease, the breath slows, the mind stops scanning for the next event. That subtle effect is no accident. It comes from artists who know that atmosphere is built one small decision at a time, and who are content to let those decisions remain almost invisible, like fine stitching inside a familiar garment. Heracles is one of Zeus's most famous children because his life is built from effort, suffering, and eventual transformation. Ancient Greek audiences did not remember him as a calm or distant figure. They remembered a hero whose very existence seemed to gather hardship around him. He was born into a world where divine parentage did not shield him from jealousy, danger, or confusion. In many versions of the myths, even his earliest years are marked by tension, with Hera's hostility shaping the path ahead. That detail matters because Heracles is never presented as someone who simply receives greatness. His greatness has to be earned again and again through strain that feels almost larger than the body carrying it. The 12 labors are the heart of his legend, and each one gives a different shape to endurance. Ancient storytellers arranged them as a sequence of almost unimaginable tasks: monstrous animals, impossible geography, fierce cleansing, and ordeals that seem to move from the wild edges of the world back toward civilization itself. Heracles does not conquer these labors by elegance. He does so by force, patience, and stubborn continuation. The stories have a rough, physical rhythm to them. One can almost imagine dust, sweat, scraped stone, and the tired silence after a long struggle. Yet the deeper meaning of the cycle is not just strength, it is persistence in the face of disorder. Heracles becomes a figure for the long road through chaos. He does not escape hardship, he moves through it. This is important when we think about Zeus's children, because not all of them are serene gods seated above the world. Some are restless, conflicted, or burdened by the consequences of their own birth. Heracles especially belongs to the borderland between human and divine. In Greek thought, that borderland mattered a great deal. He is often called a hero rather than a god, even though he is deeply tied to Olympus and later granted divine honors in many traditions. That dual identity gave him unusual power. Heroes were not simply admired, they were remembered at shrines, tombs, and local sanctuaries with a seriousness that was almost religious. Their presence was felt in place and ritual, not just in story. Heracles therefore lived in two worlds at once, and that in-between status made him especially resonant. In later Greek tradition, Heracles also became a traveler. He appears in many lands, many cults, and many local legends, which is one reason his image became so widespread. Wherever difficult strength was admired, his name could be brought in. He could be placed at city gates, along roads, near mountain passes, or beside sanctuaries where protection mattered. Some communities remembered him as a founder, others as a visitor, and others as a kind of timeless strongman whose stories adapted to local needs. This wide distribution helped make him one of the most recognizable figures in the Mediterranean world. His stories traveled well because they were simple at the center and flexible at the edges. Dionysus, another child of Zeus, brings a very different kind of energy. He is associated with wine, ecstasy, theater, and the loosening of ordinary boundaries. Ancient Greece did not see him as merely cheerful or festive. He could be gentle, but he could also be disquieting. His presence in myth often reveals what happens when control softens and hidden forces rise to the surface. That is part of his long appeal. Dionysus does not remain comfortably within the orderly world. He disturbs it, renews it, and exposes how thin its surfaces can be. Dionysus's birth story is one of the most unusual in Greek mythology. He is often described as being born from Semele and then carried in part through Zeus himself, which gave him an identity marked by fragility and divine rescue. Different traditions vary in small details, and that uncertainty is itself revealing. Some tell the story with a mortal mother destroyed by the sight of Zeus in full divine form. Others place more emphasis on the saving and hidden gestation of the child, as if Dionysus had to be protected from the very beginning. In either case, the myth frames him as a god whose life begins in danger and interruption. That complicated beginning suited a deity who repeatedly stands between life and death, order and abandon. In theatre, his influence is especially important because drama itself grew in the world of his festivals. When ancient Athenians gathered for performances, they were not simply seeking entertainment in the modern sense. They were participating in a civic and religious experience shaped by ritual memory. Dionysus was linked to masks, chorus, song, and the possibility of becoming temporarily other than oneself. The stage offered a structured place for emotion to move. That is one reason his presence feels so enduring in cultural history. He represents not just wine, but transformation under careful observation, where the boundaries of identity can be explored without fully dissolving the social world. This makes him one of the most culturally important of Zeus's children. He is not only the god of wine, he is a god of transformation, performance, and altered perception. Through him, the ancient world explored joy, grief, and the strange thinning of the ordinary self. Some myths emphasize his wandering, with followers, rites, and resistance from cities that do not understand him. Others emphasize his power to bring release, fertility, and a kind of ecstatic completeness. He reminds us that divine family in myth is not always comfortable. Sometimes it reveals the parts of life that are intense, emotional, and difficult to contain. Together, Heracles and Dionysus show how broad Zeus's family can be. One child represents the long discipline of heroic labor. Another embodies ecstasy, release, and transformation. Both are powerful, both are memorable, and both show how Zeus's offspring can point toward very different meanings of greatness. It is striking that Greek myth can hold these figures in the same divine genealogy without forcing them into the same shape. That openness is part of the richness of the tradition. Divine kinship does not create uniformity, it creates contrast. Ancient storytellers kept these figures alive because they answered different needs. Sometimes people wanted a model of endurance, sometimes they wanted a model of release. The children of Zeus could supply both, and that flexibility is one reason their myths endured so long. Heracles offered the image of carrying burden after burden without surrendering to exhaustion. Dionysus offered the opposite lesson, or perhaps the complementary one, that human life also includes surrender, celebration, and the brief loosening of rigid control. Both patterns were necessary in the ancient imagination, and both remain understandable now. Heracles also mattered because his story was not only about victory over monsters, it was about the human cost of becoming admirable. Many versions of his life contain moments of loss, exile, rage, repentance, and instability. That emotional range gives his legend its depth. A purely triumphant hero would be easy to admire, but harder to believe in. Heracles feels more lived in because he is troubled. His strength is not smooth, it is rugged and sometimes painful. That roughness may be one reason he continued to be honored across such a wide area. He could speak to struggle in a way that was both dramatic and familiar. Some later traditions also connected Heracles with purification and renewal. After violent acts or disastrous episodes, he is often sent into service, as if work itself can reorganize the soul. This idea appears in many mythic systems, where labor is not merely punishment but a way of re-entering the world after disorder. In Heracles' case, the labors become almost symbolic of the effort required to live with one's own power. He is not simply a destroyer of threats. He is a figure who must learn how to carry immense force without being consumed by it. That gives his myth a reflective quality beneath the action. Dionysus, by contrast, often appears where fixed identity becomes uncertain. His worship included ritual and communal structure, but the god himself frequently stands for the edge of that structure. His followers in myth, whether called Maenads or Bacchantes in different contexts, are often associated with movement, music, and a kind of collective release. Scholars have long noted that Dionysian traditions seem to combine celebration with unease. The same rite that brings joy can also suggest overwhelming intensity. This ambiguity is part of the god's character. He does not mean only one thing. He carries contradiction without resolving it too quickly. That is one reason Dionysus remained such a potent figure in Greek thought. He could illuminate not just pleasure, but the fragility of boundaries. In a world that valued measure, order, and civic form, he represented what happened when those things were tested, not destroyed entirely perhaps, but made porous. For that reason, he is often one of the most psychologically suggestive of Zeus's children. He seems to understand that human beings do not live by restraint alone. They also require music, release, tears, laughter, and the occasional safe passage beyond ordinary selfhood. The contrast between Heracles and Dionysus is especially meaningful because both figures are associated with extremes, yet they move in opposite directions. Heracles pushes outward against resistance. Dionysus pulls inward toward altered states or outward into collective ecstasy. One is the hard labor of the visible world, the other is the fluid intensity of experience. One is mountain, stone, and road, the other is vine, cup, mask, and chorus. Ancient mythology did not need to choose between them. It allowed both to exist as aspects of divine inheritance. There is also a quiet historical reason these stories lasted. Heracles could be adapted to local heroic traditions, making him useful to cities, kings, and sanctuaries. Dionysus could be adapted to ritual calendars, seasonal festivals, and dramatic performance. Their myths were not preserved only because they were dramatic. They were preserved because they were useful in religious life, in art, and in social memory. This practical flexibility gave the stories a kind of endurance that mere entertainment could not provide. When modern readers look at the children of Zeus, it can be tempting to imagine a simple family tree of exceptional beings. But the ancient material is more textured than that. Births are often strange. Parentage is sometimes contested. Roles shift over time. A figure can be mortal in one tradition and divine in another, or revered in one city and secondary in another. Heracles and Dionysus especially show how myth resists neat classification. Their stories are not tidy records. They are living narratives shaped by ritual, poetry, local pride, and the slow accumulation of cultural memory. In that sense, these two sons of Zeus do more than fill space in a pantheon. They express two enduring human experiences. There is the experience of carrying heavy things, of persisting through difficulty, of becoming strong without becoming untouched. And there is the experience of release, of stepping outside the ordinary self, of finding meaning in music, drink, performance, and shared emotion. The Greeks gave divine form to both. That is part of why these figures still feel vivid even now, after so many centuries. The children of Zeus are varied because the world itself is varied. Some myths shine with order, others open onto uncertainty. Some figures stand for labor and others for ecstasy. Heracles and Dionysus remain especially memorable because they make those differences visible in human terms. Their stories are not distant decorations from an old religion. They are ways of thinking about strength, transformation, and the quiet complexity of being alive. Perseus belongs among Zeus's children because his story combines divine help, mortal danger, and the idea that cleverness can survive where brute force cannot. In the Greek imagination, he is one of the clearest examples of a hero whose life is shaped by both heavenly ancestry and very human vulnerability. His mother Danae is protected from the world, yet still reached by Zeus in the famous tale of the Golden Shower, a myth that has been interpreted in many different ways over the centuries. Whatever one makes of that image, the result is a child who stands between worlds from the beginning. Perseus is born into secrecy, danger, and prophecy, and this gives his life a quiet sense of inevitability. His most famous adventure is the slaying of Medusa, a task that ancient audiences would have understood as both terrifying and symbolic. Medusa's gaze turns living beings to stone, so Perseus must approach the impossible with tools, guidance, and caution. He succeeds not because he is reckless, but because he is aided by the gods and able to act with care. The polished shield, the winged sandals, the curved sword, and the bag for the head all suggest that heroism in myth is not simply strength. It is also preparation, patience, and the ability to look indirectly at what cannot be faced head-on. That detail would have mattered to ancient listeners. Perseus is a hero of distance and reflection, a figure who survives by using intelligence where direct confrontation would fail. His tale then continues into rescue, travel, and dynasty. After the horror of Medusa, the narrative opens outward into the Mediterranean world, as though the hero's path were also a map of Greek memory. He saves Andromeda from a sea monster in a scene that is both dramatic and strangely serene in later artistic retellings, where the great danger is often softened by graceful composition. In older versions, the threat is serious and immediate, tied to royal error, divine anger, and the fragile position of human communities beside the sea. Perseus becomes not merely a monster slayer, but a rescuer whose arrival changes the fate of another household. He then founds lines of ancestry, and through those descendants, he becomes part of the broader web of heroic memory that Greeks used to connect local regions with grand mythic history. Mythic genealogy mattered a great deal. It helped families, cities, and ruling houses imagine themselves as belonging to an older and more prestigious order. Perseus is important not only as a monster slayer, but as a founder figure. In myth, founders matter because they give cities, kingdoms, and families a prestigious past. They create continuity where history is uncertain. They allow a place to say, in effect, that it has roots in the age when gods still moved more openly among human beings. Perseus, then, is not just an individual hero. He is a source of descent, a carrier of memory, and a bridge between perilous adventure and settled identity. The stories about Perseus also show how Zeus's children often occupy a transitional space. They are not fully remote like some Olympian gods, but they are not ordinary mortals either. They move between worlds. That movement is part of what gives them narrative force. Ancient people could imagine their own vulnerabilities in the hero's journey while still feeling the presence of divine favor above it. Perseus crosses thresholds at every stage, from concealed birth to public recognition, from the island to the palace, from the seen world to the hidden one, from the mortal realm to a fame that outlives him. In many myths, that in-between status is where the deepest meaning gathers. Zeus's children often do not settle neatly into one category. They may be admired, feared, protected, or used as signs of the gods, reach into human affairs. Perseus is especially useful for this because his story is both exciting and orderly. It moves with the logic of a quest, but it also reflects the ancient belief that divine favor may appear through unlikely means. He is a hero who survives by accepting help, and that gives his myth a calm kind of dignity. Helen and the Dioscuri present another branch of the family. Helen, though often remembered for the events that led to the Trojan War, is traditionally connected to Zeus through her mother Leda. Her beauty becomes one of the most influential forces in Greek legend, not because beauty itself is the point, but because it can reshape alliances, cities, and the course of epic history. The story around her is a reminder that myth often gives enormous consequences to seemingly personal events. A meeting, a marriage, an abduction, a desire, or a rivalry can widen into years of war and sorrow. Helen's place in the tradition is complex because she is both a person and a symbol. Ancient authors sometimes treated her with blame, sometimes with sympathy, and sometimes with awe. She can appear as cause, victim, prize, or enigma. In the quiet structure of myth, she shows how a single figure can gather many meanings at once. Beauty in these stories is never just visual. It is political, social, and almost weather-like in its force. It changes the atmosphere around it. It attracts armies. It unsettles homes. It makes memory itself feel unstable, because people disagree about what happened and why. The Dioscuri, Castor, and Polydeuces are a pair especially associated with brotherhood, rescue, sailors, and protective presence. Their dual nature is fascinating because one is often described as mortal and the other immortal, which creates a quiet tension between shared identity and unequal fate. Ancient sources vary in the details, and that variation itself is part of their charm as mythic figures. In some tellings, both are sons of Zeus. In others, only one is divine, while the other belongs to a mortal father. This uncertainty seems fitting for twins who blur categories. Their story gives ancient audiences a way to think about companionship across difference. They are often imagined as appearing at moments of danger, especially in storms, when their presence could be taken as a good omen. Sailors and travelers value them as patrons of safety at sea, and their image could bring comfort in dangerous weather. Even in Roman times, they retained this protective quality, showing how deeply their cult and legend had settled into Mediterranean life. Their stars, later associated with the constellation Gemini, made them especially visible in the night sky, where their paired identity became part of celestial imagination. For people standing on a shore after sunset, the thought of twin protectors above the horizon would have offered a gentle kind of reassurance. This pair also shows how Zeus's children can appear not only as solitary figures, but as kinship bonds. Myth was deeply interested in siblings, because siblings reveal comparison, loyalty, competition, and complementarity. Castor and Polydeuces are remembered together, and their story asks what it means to love across the boundary between mortality and immortality. That boundary is one of the most haunting in Greek myth. A mortal sibling can age, suffer, and die, while the divine one remains untouched by time. Yet the stories resist simple separation. The bond between the twins becomes more important than any category that divides them. Ancient listeners would have understood this as both a family story and a meditation on shared fate. Brothers and sisters in myth often reflect the larger human condition. We are joined to others, but not identical to them. We may share blood, memory, and duty, while still facing different destinies. The Dioscuri embody that quiet truth with unusual tenderness. Another child sometimes linked to Zeus is Hermes in some traditions of divine complexity, though he is more commonly the son of Zeus and Maia. He is worth mentioning because he reflects a wider pattern among Zeus's offspring. Cleverness, movement, and mediation recur often in the family. Whether the child is warrior, singer, judge, or trickster, there is usually some form of transition involved. The children of Zeus often stand at doors, borders, roads, or thresholds in the symbolic sense, even when not literally depicted there. Hermes especially embodies motion. He is the messenger, the guide, the conductor between places, and the one who understands routes that others overlook. Even if his parentage is more securely established elsewhere, his presence in the wider family pattern is revealing. Greek myth often grouped divine qualities by family resemblance, not just by strict descent. The traits associated with Zeus's children, speed, adaptability, intelligence, persuasion, charisma, and the ability to cross boundaries, reappear in many forms. That flexibility allowed myth to remain alive. A story did not need to fit a single system perfectly in order to feel true. Instead, stories overlapped, echoed, and adjusted to local custom. Hermes reminds us that the boundaries of myth are often as important as the center. Ancient Greek myths used these children to embody the many ways greatness could appear. Sometimes greatness was a radiant mind, sometimes it was a heroic endurance, sometimes it was beauty that changes kingdoms, sometimes it was twinship, rescue, or skill with a dangerous task. The family is large enough to hold all of these, and that is what makes it so enduring in memory. Zeus himself is an expansive figure, and his offspring mirror that breadth. They do not all follow one pattern, and that is part of the appeal. Some are celebrated for strength, some for diplomacy, some for cunning, and some for their place in sacred stories that blur the line between myth and cult. Ancient people were not simply collecting names, they were organizing experience. A world with storms, births, warfare, marriages, journeys, and buried ancestors needed many kinds of divine descendants to make sense of it. The children of Zeus became ways of speaking about human possibility at its widest range. They gave shape to excellence, danger, and inheritance without reducing any of them to a single rule. As the stories move outward, each child carries a different kind of inheritance, and each inheritance teaches something about the Greeks themselves, their cities, their rituals, their fears, and their fascination with the distance between human life and divine origin. That distance is never absolute in myth, but it is always felt. Zeus's children can intervene, protect, punish, guide, or simply remind mortals that greatness may arrive in forms that are difficult to predict. Their stories were retold at feasts, in temples, in poems, and in local traditions where a community could find itself mirrored in the deeds of a heroic ancestor or a shining twin. They remain compelling because they are varied. Some are beautiful, some are dangerous, some are helpful, and some are ambiguous. Together they form a family portrait that is less like a single image and more like a constellation, with each figure bright in its own way, and all of them hanging in the broader sky of Greek imagination. The ancient Greeks did not treat parentage as a small detail. To say that someone was a child of Zeus was to place that person inside a moral and political universe before the story had even really begun. It suggested importance, but also expectation. A name like that carried weight. In epic poetry and later myth, genealogy often works like a quiet doorway, opening the listener into a wider pattern of meaning. If a figure is described as the offspring of Zeus, then that figure arrives already marked by inheritance, by connection, and by the long shadow of a divine father. This mattered in a world where lineage shaped identity in very practical ways. Noble houses, royal families, and even some cities liked to claim descent from divine figures or heroic ancestors. That was not only a matter of pride, it was a language of legitimacy. A sacred ancestor could help explain why a family was considered fit to rule, why a ritual was especially ancient, or why a local sanctuary deserved honor. In that sense, Zeus's children were often part of political memory as much as religious imagination. Myth gave a sacred shape to social order, and genealogy helped make that shape feel natural. The stories also reveal the Greek interest in inheritance through the mother as well as the father. Many of Zeus's children are born through mortal women, and that pattern gives the myths a particular emotional texture. The mother is not simply a vessel or an incidental detail. She is the place where two worlds meet. One side of the child's origin reaches toward Olympus, toward divine force, brightness, and danger. The other side remains tied to the human world, with its labor, vulnerability, aging, and local memory. This double inheritance gives Zeus's children a special place in the imagination. They are often both elevated and fragile. Semele, for instance, is remembered because her relationship with Zeus leads to the birth of Dionysus. Her story is tragic, but it is also one of the clearest examples of how overwhelming divine presence can be. In the familiar version, Zeus reveals himself too fully, and mortal life cannot endure that exposure. Greek myth often returns to this pattern. The gods are near, but nearness can be perilous. The human body is not made to receive the full intensity of divine reality. Yet the child survives even when the mother does not, and that creates a story that is both tender and sorrowful. Dionysus becomes a god of life, ecstasy, and transformation, but his birth is marked by loss. The warmth of his future cult is shadowed by the danger that brought him into the world. There is a kind of emotional contrast in Semele's tale that the Greeks seem to have understood very deeply. On one level, it is a story about desire and trust. On another, it is about thresholds. A mortal woman approaches a god, not knowing fully what the encounter will cost. The result is not simple punishment, but a mythic pattern in which mortal limits are made visible. In many ancient tellings, Dionysus is later preserved, sewn into Zeus's thigh and brought to completion there. The image is strange, but it is also memorable because it suggests that divine birth does not follow ordinary biological time. It requires a kind of rescue, repair, and second gestation. That makes Semele's story one of the most haunting in the whole body of Zeus myths. Alcmene, the mother of Heracles, offers a very different mood. She is remembered as steadfast, beautiful, and central to one of the most famous heroic lineages in Greek legend. Through her, the child of Zeus is rooted in a household that feels human before it becomes monumental. Her story is set not in a luminous divine distance, but in the domestic world of marriage, expectation, and trust. That contrast matters. Heracles is often imagined as a force of enormous strength, but his beginnings are quiet in comparison. He is born into a mortal family, in the ordinary rhythms of a house, and that ordinary setting makes his later life even more dramatic. In many versions of the story, Zeus comes to Alcmene in disguise, taking the place of her husband Amphitryon. The detail has been discussed for centuries, both as mythic motif and as a sign of the god's tricky, elusive nature. Zeus does not always appear in an obvious divine form. He often arrives through transformation, concealment, or symbolic substitution. That pattern gives the myths a softer kind of strangeness. The god is present, but not always visibly so. The child that follows is therefore born from a moment that is at once intimate and uncanny, familiar and not quite stable. Heracles inherits this tension. He belongs to a human household, yet he is always more than human expectation can comfortably contain. Alcmene herself is important because she grounds the myth in human endurance. Her role is not decorative. In the background of Heracles, Fame is a mother who bears a complicated birth, a complicated household, and the consequences of divine interference. The Greek stories do not always linger on her emotions, but later readers have often noticed how much her presence matters. Without her, Heracles would not be so fully tied to ordinary mortal life, and his struggles would lose some of their poignancy. He is not a god who merely descends among people. He is a child shaped by both burden and belonging. Leda, mother of Helen, and in the traditional account the Dioscuri, appears in one of the most famous and visually rich myths in ancient Greece. The story of Zeus in swan form has fascinated artists for centuries because it joins beauty, strangeness, and transformation in a single image. The swan is graceful, white, and quiet, yet in myth it becomes the shape of power and desire. Zeus does not approach simply as himself. He arrives through disguise, and that disguise gives the story its unsettling atmosphere. The scene is often treated in art with great elegance, but beneath that elegance lies a distinctly mythic ambiguity. There are different versions of Leda's story, and ancient sources are not always fully consistent about the parentage of Helen, Castor, Pollux, and their siblings. Some traditions distinguish between divine and mortal fathers among the twins, while others emphasize the mingling of origins. That uncertainty is part of the myth's life. Greek stories often existed in more than one version at once, and listeners may have known several possibilities side by side. What remains constant is the sense that Leda's children are unusual, marked by charm, fame, and destiny. Helen, in particular, will become one of the central figures in the mythic imagination of war, beauty, and consequence. The Leda myth also shows how Greek mythology repeatedly links divine conception with liminal imagery. Birds, animals, clouds, rain, and flashes of light are not just decorative details. They express the idea that Zeus does not belong to ordinary patterns of encounter. His presence slips across categories. In one moment he may be kingly and visible. In the next he may be hidden in a shape that is almost fragile. The child born from such an encounter often inherits that same sense of displacement. Helen's beauty and the drama that follows her can be read as part of this inherited instability. She is not simply a woman in a story. She is a figure whose birth already belongs to a complicated web of divine and human desire. This is part of why Zeus's children became such fertile subjects for art, poetry, and later retelling. The stories allow for both grandeur and intimacy. A child of Zeus can be the focus of a city's worship or the center of a domestic sorrow. They can belong to the sky and to the hearth at the same time. That dual belonging is one reason the myths remain compelling. They do not separate the cosmic from the personal. Instead, they let the two scales of experience overlap. In vase painting, tragedy, epic, and later literary traditions, the children of Zeus appear again and again as figures of transition. They move between family and fate, between local memory and Pan-Hellenic fame. A city might honor a hero descended from Zeus because that hero gives the community a sacred past. A poet might focus on the same figure because divine parentage allows the story to expand beyond the ordinary. The presence of Zeus in the background does not remove human feeling, it intensifies it. Love, fear, jealousy, pride, and grief all become larger when a god is involved. And in that tension, Greek mythology becomes deeply human. The gods are beyond us, but their families still feel strangely recognizable. Rivalries, births, inheritances, and expectations are all there, only enlarged into the scale of legend. The myths are not cold abstractions. They are full of parent-child relationships, of secrecy and recognition, of the burdens that come with being someone's offspring. A divine father does not eliminate family conflict. In many cases, it makes the conflict more complicated because the stakes are no longer only domestic. They are cosmic, civic, and symbolic at the same time. This is also why so many stories about Zeus's children carry an undertone of mixed blessing. A child born from the god may receive beauty, strength, eloquence, or royal stature, but the gift often comes with danger, displacement, or sorrow. The mother may suffer. The child may be exposed to jealousy, prophecy, or impossible tasks. Even victory may feel costly. The mythic pattern seems to suggest that divine favor is never simple. It shines, but it also burns. That is one of the reasons these stories have survived so long in the cultural memory. So when ancient people spoke of Zeus's children, they were also speaking about what it means to inherit power, to carry a name, and to live under the shadow of a force larger than oneself. They were thinking about how families become history, how history becomes legend, and how a human life can be transformed by the story told about its beginning. In those myths, parentage is never merely a fact. It is a form of fate, and sometimes a form of burden, carried quietly from one generation to the next. One of the most revealing things about Zeus's children is how often they appear not simply as famous figures, but as protectors. Athene protects cities with intelligence and restraint. Apollo protects through prophecy, healing, and the measured clarity of ritual. Artemis guards the wild places that lie beyond roads and rooftops. The Dioscuri watch over sailors, riders, and travelers moving through uncertain distances. Even when their stories are dramatic, the underlying pattern is steady. Ancient myth did not imagine divine offspring merely as privileged beings drifting above human life. It imagined them as powers assigned to particular kinds of help. This gives Greek mythology a practical quality that can be easy to miss if the stories are read only for their battles and betrayals. A thunder god's family becomes a set of specialized presences. One child helps with war strategy, another with medicine, another with safe passage, another with the preservation of sacred order. In a world where weather, illness, and warfare could all change a life in an instant, that specialization mattered. Worshippers could direct prayer toward the form of aid they needed, as if the divine household had many doors, each opening onto a different kind of strength. At the same time, not all divine children are comforting. Some are difficult, even dangerous, and that too is part of the pattern. Ares, in some traditions, is also a child of Zeus and Hera, and his presence in the mythic family reminds us that Zeus's household includes conflict itself. War is not merely an event in myth, something that happens from the outside. It can be embodied as a person. That person can then be placed within the family line, as though violence and order were siblings sharing the same ancestry. The idea is unsettling, but also deeply human in its own way, because it suggests that societies understood conflict not as an accident, but as a force that belonged to the world's structure. This relationship between order and disorder is one of the major themes in Zeus's children, and it appears again and again in different forms. Athene often stands for ordered intelligence, the kind that plans before it acts and seeks victory without waste. Ares represents raw conflict, heat without patience, movement without calculation. Apollo can bring harmony, but he can also bring severity, and his light can be both comforting and punishing. Dionysus loosens control and opens the mind to ecstasy, while Artemis preserves distance from human settlement and keeps certain spaces untouched. Heracles, in another mode, labors through impossible tasks, turning pain into endurance. The family is broad enough to contain every one of these modes, and perhaps that is why it remains so compelling. It is also worth noticing how often the children of Zeus are associated with transformation. Dionysus transforms perception, making familiar things seem strange, and strange things seem alive with meaning. Heracles transforms from suffering hero into immortalized figure after his labors are complete. Perseus transforms danger into dynastic foundation by defeating a monster and carrying the story forward into new lines of descent. Helen transforms the political landscape of the Aegean through the force of mythic beauty, becoming a single figure around whom a vast war can be imagined. These are not static stories. They are stories of change, and often of change that is costly, irreversible, and strangely illuminating. That may be one reason ancient listeners kept returning to them. A mythic family full of transformation gave them a language for the changes of their own lives. Victory, loss, maturation, marriage, travel, war, and city building could all be told in divine terms. The children of Zeus became a way to think about change without reducing it to chaos. The stories did not promise that life would be orderly, but they did suggest that events could still be understood, named, and placed within a larger pattern. For a listener settling into a long evening, that kind of structure would have felt almost like a shelter. The myths also preserve local variation, which is one of the reasons they remain so rich. Different Greek communities emphasized different children of Zeus. One city treasured a daughter whose wisdom reflected its own ideals. Another celebrated a son whose healing oracles drew pilgrims from far away. One region elevated a heroic line tied to its own royal ancestry. Another gave more importance to a figure of cleansing, ritual order, or sea travel. Zeus's family, therefore, became a shared framework into which many communities could place their own sacred stories. The family was recognizable everywhere, yet never entirely the same from place to place. That flexibility is a quiet reason these myths survived so well. They were large enough to hold many meanings at once. They could be retold without losing their basic shape. A story about a divine child could be read as a local origin tale, a moral example, a cult explanation, or a poetic image of human possibility. In this sense, the children of Zeus are not only characters, they are also containers, each one carrying a different cluster of memories, rituals, and hopes. And so, as we continue, it becomes easier to see the children of Zeus not as isolated names, but as a kind of divine vocabulary. Through them, the ancient world spoke about protection, conflict, wisdom, movement, and the soft boundaries between human life and the gods. Their stories helped people imagine what kind of help could exist in the world, what kind of danger could not be avoided, and what kind of change might still lead somewhere meaningful. When scholars look at these figures together, they often notice how many of them sit between categories. They are not always fully domestic, nor fully wild. Not always purely violent, nor purely peaceful. Not always human in feeling, nor entirely distant from it. That in-between quality gives them a special power. Zeus's children often appear where a boundary needs to be crossed carefully. the line between city and field, between illness and health, between youth and adulthood, between danger and rescue. Myth uses them to make those thresholds visible, almost touchable in the imagination. Even the family relationships themselves can be complicated in ways that reflect older layers of Greek storytelling. Some children are securely placed in Zeus's line, while others belong to traditions that vary from one author or region to another. Ancient genealogy was not always a fixed chart. It could be shaped by poetry, cult, politics, and local pride. This means that the children of Zeus are not only a list of descendants, they are also evidence of how Greeks organized sacred memory, often allowing several versions to stand beside one another without insisting on a single final answer. That openness is especially important in myths involving divine maternity, mortal mothers, and shifting parentage. A figure might be claimed by Zeus in one story and by another god or local power in another. Sometimes this tells us about the prestige of Zeus's name. Sometimes it tells us about a community's wish to connect itself to a broader sacred world, and sometimes it simply shows that myth was comfortable with plurality. Ancient listeners did not always demand strict consistency. They often valued resonance more than certainty. This is one reason the children of Zeus can feel so spacious when read slowly. They do not force a single interpretation. Instead, they create a field of meanings that overlap like distant sounds at night. A hero may be brave but also troubled. A goddess may be gentle but also severe. A divine child may bless, punish, guide, or disturb. The pattern is not chaos exactly. It is a layered order, one that leaves room for human ambiguity. There is also a quieter emotional dimension to these stories. Many of the children of Zeus are associated with care, but not always in an intimate or warm sense. Their care can be distant, formal, or rule-bound. Athene may help with strategy, but she does not remove the necessity of effort. Apollo may heal, but he also reminds mortals of limits. Artemis may protect, but she preserves distance as much as safety. The aid offered by these figures is often real, yet never simple. It comes with expectations, with boundaries, and with a sense that the world remains larger than any one human wish. That balance between comfort and limit may have been deeply valuable in ancient life. A listener hearing these stories would not necessarily seek a god who solved everything. More often, they would seek a power that could be approached correctly, honored properly, and trusted to act within its nature. The children of Zeus make that arrangement imaginable. They are close enough to matter and distant enough to remain divine. Their stories also reflect the way ancient communities thought about excellence. A child of Zeus was often not merely successful, but exemplary in a particular domain. Athene is not just clever, she is wisdom embodied. Apollo is not just musical, he is order, light, and disciplined expression. Artemis is not just independent, she is the principle of untamed freedom. Heracles is not just strong, he is perseverance carried beyond normal human measure. This kind of mythic exaggeration creates figures that are easy to remember and hard to exhaust, because each one distills a human quality into a form that can be contemplated from many angles. Yet these figures are not always admirable in a simple way. They can be severe, distant, proud, or uncompromising. Myth rarely smooths away the difficult edges of power. Instead, it preserves them. A god's child may protect a city while also demanding sacrifice. A hero may rescue many while causing sorrow elsewhere. A healer may also bring plague. A guardian of the wild may be merciful to animals and relentless toward intruders. This complexity gives the stories their depth. It also makes them feel less like moral lessons and more like observations about the way power actually behaves. For that reason, the children of Zeus can be read as a map of forces rather than a roster of personalities. The map includes intelligence, war, ecstasy, healing, travel, craftsmanship, endurance, and beauty. It also includes the shadows that follow those gifts: arrogance, rupture, suffering, loss, and divine jealousy. To move through the family is to move through a complete mythic landscape, one where every force has a face and every face has a story. That is perhaps why the family keeps returning in literature, art, and later interpretation. It offers a structure vast enough to contain both brilliance and unease. It speaks to cities, households, travelers, and kings. It speaks to those seeking protection and those trying to understand disruption. It speaks to the mind that wants order and the heart that knows life is rarely orderly for long. And because these stories were retold over centuries, they accumulated layers like soft sediment, each age adding a little more meaning without removing what came before. So when we think about the children of Zeus, it helps to imagine them not as distant ornaments in a fixed pantheon, but as living categories within the Greek imagination. They are ways of naming the world's recurring needs. They are ways of expressing what can be guided, what can be endured, and what can never be fully controlled. Their stories move slowly, but they move with purpose. And in that steady movement, they preserve the ancient sense that even among the uncertainties of mortal life, there may still be forms of divine presence suited to each path we have to take. Some of Zeus's children are better known through sculpture, vase painting, and temple decoration than through any single surviving literary source, and that is an important part of how Greek mythology actually lived in the ancient world. Myth was never only a matter of reading stories in isolation. It was visual, local, and ceremonial, moving through sanctuaries, public squares, dining rooms, burial spaces, and domestic corners of the home. A painted scene on a vase could capture a god or hero in a pose that revealed what a community valued most. A temple statue could make one of Zeus's children feel present in a city for generations, not as an abstract idea, but as a watchful shape that belonged to the place. In that sense, images were not merely decorations. They were a kind of shared memory, a way for mythology to remain close to daily life. Athene, for example, appears constantly in art because her iconography is so clear and so stable across many contexts. Helmet, spear, shield, and calm expression create a figure that can be recognized almost at a glance, even when the style changes from one period to another. That visual consistency mattered. In a world where people encountered divine figures on pottery, coins, votive offerings, and monumental sculpture, a strong image helped fix meaning in the mind. Athene's presence in art made her not only a goddess of wisdom and strategic thought, but also a lasting symbol of Athens itself and of intelligent strength more generally. Her image could be stern without being harsh, protective without being wild. It was practical for worship, useful for civic identity, and powerful precisely because it seemed composed rather than dramatic. Apollo's visual language is different but equally memorable, and ancient artists often used restraint to suggest his special qualities. He may be shown with the lyre, the laurel, or a youthful, balanced figure that reflects his association with harmony, measure, and refined beauty. Sometimes his body appears almost as carefully ordered as the music he governs. In Greek art, he is often given a brightness that is less about literal light than about clarity of form. The lines of the image feel clean. The face tends to remain serene. Even when mythology gives him moments of anger, pursuit, or punishment, the artistic tradition around him often prefers to present an idealized stillness. The eye rests on him with a sense of order, as if the image itself were tuned like an instrument. Dionysus, by contrast, may be shown with vines, a drinking cup, a wreath of ivy, or a more relaxed and fluid posture that suggests abundance rather than discipline. His imagery can feel softer, richer, and more changeable. In some periods he appears youthful and composed, and in others he seems more mature, even almost remote, as if the god were moving between restraint and surrender. The artistic tradition around him carries a sense of motion, loosened edges, and seasonal fullness, as though form itself were beginning to sway. That does not make him chaotic in every representation, but it does give his image a different rhythm from Apollo's. Where Apollo often suggests polished clarity, Dionysus suggests transformation, warmth, and the gentle dissolution of boundaries that comes with wine, ritual, and ecstasy. Heracles is often shown with the lion's skin and club, both of which make his image immediately recognizable even to someone who does not know the entire cycle of his labors. Those attributes reduce a complicated life to a few strong signs, which is one reason mythic symbols are so effective. A single object can carry a whole story. The skin suggests one triumph over a dangerous beast, the club another expression of force and endurance, and the entire figure becomes a shorthand for struggle overcome. In many works of art, Heracles is not simply the strongest man in the room. He is the man who has already survived what others could not. His visual identity carries wear, victory, and effort together, so that his body itself seems to remember what it has endured. The Dioscuri, Castor, and Polydeuces often appear as paired horsemen or as twin protectors, whose shared image emphasizes companionship, symmetry, and mutual fate. Ancient viewers would have understood that the pair meant more together than apart. That visual logic is common in Greek art, where balance can be as meaningful as motion. The two brothers could be shown in a way that made them seem almost interchangeable, and yet never fully identical, which is fitting for twins whose story contains both closeness and difference. Their iconography was especially useful for people looking for protection in travel, in battle, or in the uncertainty of the sea. A paired image offered reassurance. It suggested that safety could come not from solitary strength, but from kinship held steady over time. Even when the stories vary from place to place, the symbols remain useful. A viewer does not always need the full myth to feel its meaning. A goddess with a spear, a god with a lyre, a hero with a club, or twins on horseback can all tell the beginning of the tale before a single word is spoken. That is one of the quiet strengths of Greek religious art. It does not always explain itself in a direct way. Instead, it invites recognition, and recognition becomes a kind of participation. A person seeing the image may remember a festival, a prayer, a family story, or simply the feeling of having grown up in a world where the divine had familiar shapes. In that way, art could carry myth across generations with very little need for explanation. This is one of the reasons the children of Zeus became so enduring in the ancient world. They were not only narrated, they were seen. Their forms lived in public spaces, on domestic objects, in sanctuaries, and in the quiet ritual life of cities and homes. A child of Zeus might appear on a cup used at a shared meal, on a painted vase placed in a tomb, or on the pediment of a temple where sunlight and shadow changed the figure throughout the day. These repeated encounters made the gods feel woven into ordinary experience. Myth was not separate from life. It was often part of the visual environment that surrounded life, settling into habits of looking and remembering. In a sense, each image helped preserve the family. The myths could shift, but the shapes stayed recognizable, and that recognition kept the stories close to the people who used them. This is especially true in a tradition like Greece's, where local versions of divine figures often coexisted with broader patterns shared across the region. One city might emphasize a god's warrior aspect, while another highlighted his beauty or his ritual function. Yet a familiar icon could travel beyond those local differences and still be understood. The image became a bridge between variation and continuity. It let a story change without disappearing. The same is true in the way ancient artists repeated certain poses and attributes over time. Repetition did not always mean dullness. Often it was a form of reverence. A set image allowed the god or hero to remain legible. It also offered a kind of stability in a world that was otherwise full of uncertainty. Storms, illness, war, and harvest failure could change the course of a life quickly. A reliable divine image, by contrast, could feel steady and present. That steadiness mattered in religion as much as in art. The people who looked at these figures were not only admiring them, they were living among them. There is also something gentle in the way these images allow memory to gather. A single object might carry a festival association, while a painted scene could preserve a local legend no longer found in surviving literature. Modern readers sometimes imagine that texts are more authoritative than images, but the ancient world did not always separate them so sharply. A vase painter, a sculptor, and a poet could all contribute to the same mythic atmosphere from different directions. Sometimes the image preserves a detail the literature does not emphasize. Sometimes it simplifies. Sometimes it adds a mood that no surviving line of verse can fully capture. That ambiguity is part of the charm of Greek mythic art, and part of why it remains so compelling. Athene's steadiness, Apollo's balance, Dionysus's fluidity, Heracles' endurance, and the Dioscuri's paired symmetry each reveal how divine identity could be shaped by visual habit as much as by story. Their images were not random. They developed through centuries of use, contest, and repetition. Artists inherited conventions and adjusted them, while worshippers learned to recognize divine presence through familiar signs. The result was a living visual language, one that could speak in markets and sanctuaries alike. And because these gods were children of Zeus, their images also carried the weight of family resemblance. Each one was distinct, but each also reflected something of the larger divine order from which they came. For later viewers, especially those encountering the myths through museums or reproductions, this visual inheritance can feel surprisingly intimate. A fragment of a painted scene, a weathered statue, or a relief cut into stone still conveys the ancient desire to make the divine visible and approachable. The surface may be broken, but the gesture remains. A spear still rises. A lyre still rests in the hand. A lion's skin still hangs over a shoulder. Two horsemen still move together as if bound by a promise. These small signs continue to do what they did long ago: help the mind settle on a story, and help the story settle into memory. That is why the children of Zeus remained so durable in the ancient imagination. Their myths were flexible enough to travel, but their images gave them a home. They could be worshipped in one city, admired in another, and recognized in a third through a familiar outline or attribute. In an age before mass printing or modern illustration, this visual continuity was especially powerful. It made mythology portable without making it fragile. And when people looked at these figures, whether on a temple wall or a humble household object, they were often seeing more than a god or hero. They were seeing a shared cultural language, one that helped keep the family of Zeus present in the everyday world. Greek myths often describe the children of Zeus as moving through dangerous thresholds, as if their lives are shaped by the simple but unsettling fact that they do not remain in one safe place for long. They cross seas, enter underworlds, confront monsters, or step into realms of ritual, prophecy, and divine memory. This repeated pattern is not accidental. It reflects a deep mythic interest in passage, in the moment when a person leaves the familiar world and enters something larger, darker, or more uncertain. The child of Zeus is often someone who can go where ordinary people cannot, or who can survive experiences that would break a mortal life. In that sense, these stories are not only about power. They are about movement through peril, and about the strange dignity that comes from enduring what should not be endured. Perseus is a clear example of this kind of crossing. He does not simply fight Medusa in a straightforward heroic scene. He travels to the edge of the known world, into a place shaped by dread and distance, where the air itself seems to belong to old, half-remembered dangers. In later retellings, the journey becomes almost dreamlike. The grey sisters, the winged sandals, the mirrored shield, the silent approach. He returns with the head of Medusa, but the story does not end there, because the head itself becomes a source of further power and further danger. It can protect, it can terrify, and it can alter the course of later myths. That pattern is important. The crossing does not simply bring the hero back unchanged. It leaves behind an object that continues to act in the world, as if the threshold has been carried home. Heracles also lives through threshold after threshold, although his crossings are often laborious rather than sudden. His labors are not just tasks on a list, they are a sequence of passages into hostile spaces, each one testing the limits of endurance. He goes where beasts, poisons, or impossible conditions have taken hold, and he must return carrying some sign that he has survived the encounter. Sometimes the labor is physical, and sometimes it is moral, requiring restraint where force would be easier. In certain traditions, even the underworld becomes one of his destinations, which gives his story a strange double movement: descent and return, darkness and daylight, suffering and recognition. Heracles is not only the strongest of Zeus's children, he is also one of the clearest examples of how strength in myth does not mean comfort. It means exposure to trials that never fully stop. Dionysus moves through a different kind of threshold, one that is less about geography and more about state of being. He passes between ecstasy and restraint, between the ordered city and the loosened rhythms of wilderness, between human convention and something older, wetter, and more difficult to name. His worship in the Greek world often involved music, dance, masks, and altered presence, so that his mythic identity seems to hover at the edge of form. He is not always easily pinned down, and perhaps that is part of his meaning. The child of Zeus in Dionysus becomes a figure of transformation, one who reveals that identity itself can be fluid, collective, and dangerous. In quieter readings, he may seem less like a conqueror than a force that rearranges boundaries, reminding people that fixed shapes can dissolve. Artemis, though often imagined through her independence and her skill as a hunter, also belongs to the world of crossings. She roams the border between city and wilderness, between social expectation and untamed life, between the protection of the young and the violence that may meet those who violate her space. In myth, she can appear far from settlements among deer, hills, and shadowed groves, where the sounds are softer and the rules are different. At the same time, she is not separate from civic life. She receives honor in temples, festivals, and local traditions, and she is deeply tied to transitions in human life, especially those connected with growth, vulnerability, and young people. Her borderland nature gives her stories a special stillness. She is near the edge, yet not lost in it. She represents the place where civilization meets what it cannot fully tame. Apollo moves through another kind of threshold, one marked by light, song, and oracle. He is associated with clarity, but also with the unsettling precision of prophecy, which can illuminate a future without making it easier to bear. In myth and cult, he passes between healing and punishment, art and discipline, melody and warning. He can be the god of measured order, and yet he also speaks through inspired utterance that seems to arrive from beyond human control. The oracle at Delphi, in particular, gathers this atmosphere of threshold and distance. People came with questions and left with answers that were often partial, symbolic, or difficult. Apollo, as Zeus's son, becomes a figure of luminous mediation, not simply the bringer of truth, but the one who reminds mortals that truth may arrive in forms they must interpret slowly. In the same way, many stories of Zeus's children depend on recognition. A character discovers who they really are, or others discover their hidden nature, and the story changes shape at that moment. This recognition is rarely just a personal revelation. It often ties private identity to public consequence. Heracles, for example, is not merely strong in some anonymous sense. He is the son of Zeus, and that identity changes how the story is understood from the inside out. The labors are no longer random feats. They become part of a larger struggle between mortal suffering, divine parentage, and the possibility of eventual honor. Recognition in myth often restores context. It tells the audience that a life is larger than the visible moment, and that lineage can explain both glory and ordeal. Helen belongs to this pattern as well, though her stories are shaped differently depending on the tradition. She is not simply beautiful in an ordinary sense. Beauty in myth is rarely only an aesthetic quality. It can be a force that alters alliances, provokes conflict, and draws entire cities into motion. Helen's place within a divine family gives her fate a larger frame, whether one reads her as the daughter of Zeus and leader, as a figure born from egg and wonder, or as someone whose identity is surrounded by competing versions. The uncertainty itself is part of the fascination. Some stories emphasize her mortal life in Sparta, others her removal to Troy, and others the strange distance between appearance and truth. Recognition here does not always clarify. Sometimes it deepens the mystery, showing that divine ancestry can make a person more visible and more elusive at the same time. This motif of hidden nature also helps explain why these myths feel so layered. A child of Zeus may move through the world unnoticed for a time, only to be revealed later through action, omen, or genealogy. Ancient audiences would have understood the significance of such moments, since kinship in myth is never just a family detail. It is a map of influence. To recognize a divine parent is to recognize the pressure of fate, the possibility of exceptional gifts, and the likelihood of conflict that ordinary life would not otherwise contain. In stories with multiple tellings, recognition can be delayed, disputed, or symbolic, and that uncertainty makes the myths feel lived, in rather than rigidly fixed. The children of Zeus also highlight the tension between fame and pain. A mythic child may become celebrated across the Greek world, but the path to that fame can be harsh, lonely, or humiliating. Heracles is the clearest example, yet he is not alone. Many divine offspring endure conflict with mortal families, jealous gods, rival claimants, or destinies that seem to arrive before they are ready. Their greatness is therefore not a shield. It is often the reason the suffering matters so much. The stronger the figure, the more weight the story can place upon them. Fame in myth can shine like a bright, hard surface, but behind it there is often exhaustion, grief, or a sense of being pushed by forces no human could fully negotiate. Ancient audiences may have found this both moving and realistic in a mythic sense. Great power does not remove hardship, it can intensify it. A king's son might inherit conflict with his line, a god's child might inherit divine envy, and a hero might be singled out precisely because the world expects more from him than from anyone else. This idea runs through many of the myths attached to Zeus's children, giving them an emotional seriousness that extends beyond spectacle. Even when the stories are filled with monsters, chases, transformations, or miraculous births, they often settle into a quieter feeling, that elevation and suffering are strangely linked, and that being noticed by the divine can make life more difficult rather than easier. There is also a quiet theme of inheritance, not just as bloodline, but as burden. A child of Zeus may inherit beauty, strength, wisdom, or divine favor, yet the gift is rarely pure. Along with it comes suspicion, rivalry, and a life that is never fully one's own. Many myths suggest that being chosen by power is not the same as being protected by it. A divine father may confer status, but he does not always confer safety. In some traditions he intervenes, in others he remains distant, leaving the child to be shaped by the world's resistance. That distance gives the stories a particular emotional texture. The child stands in relation to greatness, but not always in comfort with it. And yet, despite all the hardship, these figures continue to matter because they accomplish things no one else can. They establish cults, cleanse polluted spaces, found cities, guide travelers, secure symbols of legitimacy, or embody ideals that communities need in order to imagine themselves. Their lives are often surrounded by local memory. A hill, a shrine, a spring, a boundary marker, or a festival may preserve the trace of what they did. In that sense, the children of Zeus belong not only to epic storytelling, but also to landscape and ritual. They are remembered in places where myth meets communal life, where the story is repeated because it explains why a place feels charged or why a practice endures. The burden and the blessing arrive together, and neither can be removed without changing the meaning of the other. This is why the children of Zeus remain such a strong topic for quiet reflection. They are not only bright myths filled with dramatic action, they are myths about responsibility, identity, inheritance, and the cost of being more than ordinary. They show how greatness can be isolating, how recognition can arrive late, and how divine descent does not cancel suffering. Instead, it often gives suffering a deeper outline. The stories keep returning to that tension because it is one of the most enduring in Greek myth. The idea that power may open doors, but it also asks for endurance, and that the life of a child of Zeus is often defined by what must be carried across the threshold. As we move onward, that cost becomes increasingly important because it helps explain why these divine relatives feel so human even when they stand above the world. The children of Zeus were often tied to cult practices that varied from city to city, and that flexibility is one of the quiet truths of Greek religion. A divine figure was not always honored in exactly the same way everywhere. The broad myth could be shared across the Greek world, while the local ritual could still take on its own shape, its own rhythm, and even its own emotional atmosphere. In one place, a sanctuary might lean toward healing, with incense, vows, and careful attention to bodily relief. In another, it might emphasize prophecy, seasonal festivals, or a protective role over the city. That local variation is deeply revealing because it shows that myth was never only a story told at a distance. It lived in places. It gathered around springs, altars, groves, and temple precincts. It adapted to the needs of the people who approached it, and in doing so it became part of the texture of daily life. Apollo at Delphi is the clearest example of a child of Zeus becoming central to sacred geography. Delphi was not just a famous shrine. It was felt as a threshold, a place where the human world seemed to thin and become more receptive to divine speech. People traveled there for guidance, for decisions about war, settlement, family, and crisis, but also simply for the experience of standing near a place believed to be touched by a god. The landscape itself mattered. The mountain slopes, the stone terraces, the cold air, the procession routes, all helped create a sense that one had entered a different order of space. The oracle at Delphi did not speak in the crisp and direct way modern audiences often imagine. Instead, it worked through ambiguity. The message might be indirect, compressed, or open to more than one interpretation. That uncertainty was not a flaw in the system. It was part of the religious experience. Interpretation became an act of devotion, and the person seeking an answer had to participate in making meaning from what was heard. Athene likewise shaped the sacred landscape of Athens, where her presence was woven into civic ritual, military identity, and artistic grandeur. In Athens, she was not a distant or abstract goddess. She was one of the main ways the city understood itself. The great festivals, the public ceremonies, the temple architecture, and the decorative arts all reflected her importance. Her image stood for intelligence, disciplined strength, and ordered civilization, but also for the city's own sense of continuity. The Parthenon, in particular, becomes more than a monument when viewed this way. It is a statement of belonging, a stone expression of reverence and civic pride. Athene's connection to Athens is a reminder that religion in the ancient world was often inseparable from public life. To honor a god could also mean to honor the city, the laws, and the shared story of the people living there. That is one of the strongest forms of religious attachment the ancient world knew, because it linked the divine not only to private faith, but to collective identity. Heracles was honored in many places as a hero with strong local relevance, and his cult shows how flexible ancient categories could be. Hero cult was not the same as worship of an Olympian god. Heroes were often remembered at tombs, burial sites, or places associated with their deeds, and they could be approached as powerful dead figures who still had influence over the living. Offerings to heroes were sometimes different in tone from offerings to full gods, with a more intimate or even solemn quality. Heracles complicates all of this because he belongs to more than one category at once. In myth, he is a man of extraordinary strength, suffering, and accomplishment, In some traditions, after death, he becomes fully divine through apotheosis. That means his cult life straddles boundaries. He can be invoked as a heroic presence rooted in human struggle, and at the same time as a god with broader cosmic status. This layered identity made him especially adaptable across the Greek world, where local communities could emphasize the version of Heracles that best fit their own needs and memories. The Dioscuri were especially beloved by sailors and travelers, who could imagine them as steady companions in moments of uncertainty. Castor and Pollux, the twin sons of Zeus in many traditions, were associated with protection, loyalty, and the sudden relief that comes when danger passes. For people crossing the sea or moving along unfamiliar roads that mattered greatly, the ancient Mediterranean could be beautiful and welcoming, but it was also full of risk. Weather changed quickly, ship routes were vulnerable, paths through mountains and open countryside could be lonely. The Dioscuri offered a sense that someone was watching. Their constellational association made this feeling even more vivid because they were visible in the sky, translated into light and pattern above the world. Myths about them could merge with astronomy in a single image. Ancient people often looked upward and saw not a random sky, but a populated one, full of divine relatives, remembered figures, and signs that carried meaning. The stars did not replace the gods, they helped keep them near. That broader sense is important because Zeus's children helped fill the world with familiar powers. The fields, the roads, the sea, the city, the theatre, and the mountain could all be connected to a divine relative in one story or another. In Greek thought, the world was not sealed off from divinity. It was layered with presences. A river might have a god. A grove might have a nymph. A city might have a patron goddess. A shoreline might be watched by a sea-born figure. The children of Zeus belonged to this crowded and meaningful environment. They made the world feel inhabited. They gave shape to places that might otherwise seem ordinary or empty. Even where the myths varied, the effect was similar. The landscape became readable. A person could move through it with memory, fear, gratitude, and ritual awareness. Nothing was quite empty, because somewhere nearby a divine story might be resting, waiting, or watching. This sacred geography also helped preserve memory. If a community honored a child of Zeus in a particular place, the story of that figure became attached to stones, rituals, and seasonal habits. A myth did not remain floating in the abstract. It settled into the life of the community. It might be revisited in annual festivals, in local processions, in the naming of places, or in the rituals surrounding a shrine. Over time, the physical setting reinforced the story, and the story in turn gave meaning to the setting. A hillside was no longer just a hillside. A temple ruin was no longer only stone. A route traveled by pilgrims became a remembered path. This is one reason myths endured so strongly in the ancient world. They were reinforced by repetition, but also by geography. The same paths were walked again and again, the same offerings were made, the same stories were told near the same altars. Memory became embodied in place, and place helped keep memory alive. That is why these figures remained so powerful over time. They were not only characters in literature, preserved for reading and retelling, they were woven into lived religious space. People encountered them through offerings, festivals, household reverence, civic ceremonies, and remembered places. They appeared in prayer, in art, in temple settings, and in the expectations attached to certain journeys or certain seasons. These encounters were often quiet rather than dramatic. A traveler might pause at a shrine. A city might process in honor of a patron. A family might leave a small dedication. The effect was cumulative. The stories continued to breathe because they were repeatedly touched by human routine. In that sense, myth was not just preserved by books or poets, it was preserved by use. There is also something especially revealing in the way these cults varied without breaking apart. Greek religion did not require perfect uniformity. Different cities could honor the same divine child in different ways and still recognize the same broad figure. Scholars sometimes speak about this as a sign of Greek religion's local character, and that is useful, but it also describes a more intimate reality. People tended to trust the version of the divine they knew in their own place. They might hear about another sanctuary and respect it, but the local shrine had its own authority because it was tied to familiar hands, familiar festivals, and familiar needs. The sacred was close enough to be practical. A god did not have to be everywhere in the same way. It was enough that the god was somewhere, and that the community knew how to approach that presence. Apollo at Delphi, Athene in Athens, Heracles in his many local sanctuaries, and the Dioscuri among seafarers all show how myth and ritual could overlap without becoming fixed and rigid. The stories were stable enough to be recognizable, but flexible enough to live in changing circumstances. That balance gave them durability. It allowed ancient people to feel both continuity and nearness. The gods remained ancient, but they were not locked in the past. They continued to matter because people continued to address them in the present. A prayer spoken at dawn, a libation poured before travel, an oracle consulted in uncertainty, a festival walk through a familiar street, all of these kept the old divine names active in the world. In that way, the children of Zeus became part of the map of ancient Greece itself. They were not only part of genealogy, not only part of heroic narrative, and not only part of literature recited aloud in public or private. They were stitched into the sacred and social geography of the Greek world. Mountains, harbors, sanctuaries, city centers, and roads all carry traces of them. To learn their stories is, in part, to learn how the Greeks imagined the world around them, and how they made that world meaningful through place, ritual, and memory. When later readers, artists, and scholars look back at the children of Zeus, one thing becomes very clear. These figures were never fixed in only one meaning. Greek myth did not preserve them like museum pieces under glass. It allowed them to move, to gather new associations, and to speak differently in different places and times. A goddess such as Athene could stand for practical wisdom, city protection, war strategy, and skilled craft. A hero such as Heracles could be read as a figure of labor, suffering, endurance, victory, and eventual divine honor. A god such as Apollo could illuminate music, healing, prophecy, youthful beauty, and the measured order of civilized life. That adaptability helped Greek myth survive across changing centuries, because it was capable of being retold without losing its essential shape. It could be adjusted to a local cult, a new poem, a public festival, or a philosophical reading and still remain recognizable. Even when the stories shifted, their deep structure remained softly intact, like a familiar melody played on different instruments. The children of Zeus are also useful for understanding how the Greeks imagined power itself. In modern life, power can sometimes feel like simple control, but in myth it is usually more complicated than that. It is relational. It is inherited, it is distributed unevenly. It comes with duties, limits, and consequences. Zeus, as king of the gods, does not produce children who all rule in the same way. Instead, his offspring reveal that divine power can specialize into many forms. One child may govern the city and its laws. Another may protect the road and the traveler. Another may inspire the song, another the hunt, another the feast, another the dangerous passage through suffering and return. In that sense, Zeus's family helps map a world in which no single force answers every human need. The Greeks seem to have understood that life was too complex for one divine function alone. So power was shared among many figures, each one bright in a different area, each one answering a different kind of vulnerability. That is part of why the family of Zeus can feel almost like a poetic atlas of Greek concerns. Ancient life was full of thresholds: birth, adulthood, marriage, war, travel, harvest, illness, grief, civic duty, and religious obligation. Every one of those experiences could feel uncertain, and every one could require a divine presence. A goddess of wisdom was needed where judgment mattered. A god of healing was needed where the body failed. A protector of the home was needed where order could break down. A god of ecstasy was needed where ordinary boundaries no longer held. A hero of endurance was needed where human suffering seemed unbearable but not meaningless. So the children of Zeus became more than characters in stories. They became ways of organizing the sacred, the heroic, and the civic into a single imaginative system. They helped ancient listeners feel that the world was not random, even when it was difficult. There was almost always a divine pattern nearby, if one knew how to listen for it. They also remain compelling because they are emotionally textured rather than abstract. Greek myth does not usually present divine children as simple symbols without feeling. Athene's calm intelligence often carries a cool steadiness, a sense of planning and clear sight. Artemis moves with untamed independence, attentive to the wild, the young, and the delicate balance between vulnerability and freedom. Apollo brings measured brightness, the ordered glow of music, prophecy, medicine, and form. Dionysus can seem like a force of transformation that unsettles boundaries, but also renews life. Heracles is marked by painful endurance, the body strained by labor and the mind tested by sorrow. Perseus carries a careful courage, less flamboyant than some heroes, but steady and purposeful. Helen, whose place among Zeus's children varies in ancient accounts, embodies a beauty so powerful that it can alter whole cities and lives. The Dioscuri, Castor, and Polydeuces suggest brotherhood, companionship, and protective nearness. Together, these figures create a family that feels complete precisely because it is so varied. Greek myth seems to understand that human experience is not one color, one tone, or one mood. It is many things at once, and the children of Zeus preserve that richness. That variety may be the most important fact of all. Zeus's children are not interchangeable, even when later traditions sometimes blur stories together or assign different genealogies to the same figure. Each one reflects a different face of mythic life, and each one gives ancient listeners a way to think about human experience through divine forms. Some are close to the city and its rules, some are close to the wilderness, some belong to music and measure, some belong to frenzy and release, some stand for proof of legitimacy while others stand for mystery. Some are known through cult, some through epic, some through tragedy, and some through later literary and artistic retellings. In that sense, the family of Zeus is not a closed list so much as a living pattern. The stories remain flexible, but the underlying idea is stable. The divine is not singular in expression. It arrives in many shapes, and the children of Zeus are among the clearest examples of that ancient truth. Another quiet feature of these figures is how often they bridge the human and the divine without fully erasing either side. Many of Zeus's children are not simply born into ease. Their stories often include testing, concealment, exile, recognition, struggle, or incomplete belonging. This makes them feel closer to mortal life. Heracles must labor. Perseus must navigate danger carefully. Dionysus must move through resistance before being accepted. Even Athene, though powerful from the start, is often depicted in relation to practical problems, contests, and acts of mediation. The children of Zeus rarely live in a world free of friction, and that may be one reason they remained so memorable. They do not offer an unreal fantasy of perfect peace. Instead, they show how excellence, legitimacy, and divine favor can emerge through tension. In that way, they mirror the Greek sense that greatness is often costly, and that the best-known figures are frequently those who have passed through difficulty rather than around it. The ancient sources themselves are not always uniform, and that uncertainty is part of the fascination. Different poets, city-states, and cult traditions preserve different versions of divine descent. Some children of Zeus are central in epic and widely recognized across the Greek world. Others appear more clearly in local worship or in later literary elaboration. A figure may be a son in one tradition, a daughter in another, or linked to Zeus in one genealogical scheme and differently framed in another. This does not necessarily signal confusion in the ancient mind so much as a different approach to sacred storytelling. Myth was not a single official database. It was a web of inherited narratives, each with its own emphasis. A community might honor a deity for a very specific function, while a poet might use that same figure to explore a larger human truth. So when we speak of the children of Zeus, we are often describing a family assembled across centuries of retelling, ceremony, and interpretation. The uncertainty itself reveals how alive these stories were. There is also something quietly revealing about the fact that so many of these figures belong to different forms of excellence. Some are martial, some are civic, some are artistic, some are domestic, some are liminal, existing at the edge of categories. Athene is not only a warrior but a wise strategist. Apollo is not only a healer but also a god of music and order. Artemis is not only a huntress but a guardian of thresholds and vulnerable transitions. Dionysus is not only a god of wine but a force that changes perception and loosens restraint. Heracles is not merely strong, he transforms suffering into completed labor. This specialization suggests that the Greeks did not imagine greatness as one undifferentiated thing. Instead, excellence had many forms, and each form required a different divine patronage or mythic pattern. The children of Zeus thus reveal a culture attentive to distinctions. To pray, to celebrate, to commemorate, or to narrate was to choose the right divine resonance for the moment. It is also striking that these stories endure so well in art. Vase painters, sculptors, temple builders, playwrights, and later Roman and Renaissance artists all return to Zeus's children because their images are so adaptable and so immediate. A spear-bearing Athene can stand for intelligence under pressure. A laurel-crowned Apollo can embody balance and clarity. A bow-bearing Artemis can suggest autonomy and distance. A struggling Heracles can show the human cost of accomplishment. A youthful Dionysus can express the fragile edge between delight and disorientation. Even when details differ from work to work, the figures remain legible. Their forms are simple enough to recognize, but layered enough to invite reflection. This visual endurance is part of their power. They live not only in poems but in the eye's memory, in the repeated shapes that ancient and later viewers encountered in sanctuaries, homes, and public spaces. At the same time, the children of Zeus often remind us that divine favor in Greek myth is not always gentle. Being connected to Zeus can bring privilege, but it can also bring burdens, rivalries, and expectations. Some children are protected, while others are tested by jealousy or danger. Some are celebrated, while others are contested. Some are legitimate in the eyes of later tradition, while others are surrounded by ambiguity. This variety matters because it prevents the family of Zeus from becoming an overly neat symbol. The myths keep the emotional weather mixed. There is honor but also strain. There is radiance but also shadow. There is fame but also sacrifice. In that balance, the stories feel more human and more memorable. They do not pretend that belonging to a great lineage removes suffering. If anything, they suggest that importance often increases exposure to pain. The family of Zeus also offers a long lesson in continuity. Across Homer, Hesiod, lyric poetry, local cult, tragedy, Hellenistic scholarship, Roman adaptation, and later mythography, these figures remain active, though never in exactly the same way. A hero who appears as one kind of marvel in an epic may later become a moral example, a civic emblem, or a subject of philosophical interpretation. A deity who begins as a local protector can become part of a wider pan-Hellenic identity. This historical layering is one reason the children of Zeus are so enduring. They are not trapped in a single cultural moment. They travel. They survive retelling because they can absorb it. They remain stable enough to be remembered and flexible enough to be used again. That combination is rare, and it helps explain why these myths still resonate after so many centuries. In the end, the children of Zeus are compelling not just because they are famous, but because they make the ancient world feel organized without being simplistic. They reveal a cosmos in which many needs have many answers, and in which the divine is expressed through distinct temperaments and tasks. They show that wisdom, courage, beauty, healing, strength, song, law, and wildness are not unrelated. They can all exist within the same mythic family, though never in the same form. That is part of the subtlety of Greek religion and storytelling. The world is not flattened into one principle. It is held together by many presences, many stories, and many names. The children of Zeus stand at the center of that pattern, each one a thread in a larger design, each one illuminating a different part of life. So if you remember only one quiet idea from this long evening, let it be this: in Greek myth, the family of Zeus is not simply a family. It is a structure for imagining the world. It is a way of saying that wisdom, war, art, beauty, terror, protection, and endurance all belong to the same great conversation. And as that conversation settles into silence, the myths do not vanish. They remain softly in memory, in art, in ritual, and in the long sleep of the imagination.